the fundamental agenda of every closing session is what's next. Isn't it, Will? You've been to these before. Mm-hmm. So what's next? So before we go on, I'd like you to think about what's next. What's next for the world? That's a serious question. What's next for your countries? That's a serious question for some of you, particularly in this room. What's next for your community? What's next for your family and your friends? And what's next for you professionally? And these are all interrelated, of course. So, in this closing session, what's next is a provocative question. What's next? Let me just start it off for Florida. Do you have any ideas?
Well,
I mean, you shared lots of vision, but let's get real. What's next? What are you going to do next?
Well, we don't have much time, and Florida is like a canary in a coal mine for land preservation issues because everything is accelerated. We're only 100 miles wide. We have 1,000 people a day moving there, and the sea level is rising on 3 sides. So if we don't take action in the next decade, we're going to have some maybe irreversible setbacks on things. I spend the last 10 years of my life focused on story and narrative and building stakeholders and vision, but it's time to do in terms of making conservation real in these places. I haven't said this publicly, but I think getting a bill on the books that will unlock millions of dollars for conservation in Florida and put the Florida Wildlife Corridor issue in the center of the conversation for all the different stakeholders could be an important step that I want to start exploring. But I think the power of taking imagery and narrative and combining it with the GIS framework that I've seen here and the depth and the parcel level information that you were presenting, that TPL is doing, and being able to report, having a framework to guide the stakeholders, but being able to report to the public every time there's a piece of progress made and every time one of those pieces of land shifts from opportunity to protected. And you can report on it, individual land trusts, small groups, bigger groups like TNC, and people can see part of the big vision as we go forward. I would love to try to make that happen.
That's good. Do you guys like to play Monopoly? Did you ever play Monopoly? How many of you like it? I started playing it when I was 7 years old. And I've never stopped, really. Shut up. It's a fantastic game. It's so engaging, and you're alive, and you're playing, and you're thinking ahead. You're strategizing. Well, you play Monopoly your entire life, right? So my suggestion about what should be next in Florida is that you become a Monopoly player. And I think what I'm saying is you start by creating a plan and a strategy. You take your visions and the science and the context of everything operating, and you create a plan, whether it's a formal plan or a personal plan, and you play hard. I mean, that's what I think, at least in my experience in life, playing hard, really playing for real, playing at 100%, going for it, having a vision, and adjusting yourself is really very important. How many of you saw the movie called Lincoln? Anybody see that movie? He's really an amazing man, Lincoln, one of our great presidents. He had a vision, which was to end slavery. We don't exactly know how he thought that through, but he did, came to that vision. He was, from my perspective, a perfect politician because he had the vision and he understood it. But at the same time, he did all the dirty work behind the scenes. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. The movie brought it out. He made all these little filthy trades with politicians. He traded this for that so that he could get the vote. which passed in Congress and got it done. So he played the high role, the visionary role, but at the same time, he did the, I call it dog shit work behind the scenes to get it done. You know what I'm talking about, Will? Mm-hmm. So, you know exactly what I mean. Yeah. You're making land trades, you're paying this, you're trading this for that, you're sucking up to that, you're doing all the work. So in my experience, Will Rogers, you're a player. And you know how to do both the vision, but you also know how to get real, like getting down to the parcel, playing the game with real estate people, with all of it, right? And to me, that's what excites things. I mean, we've talked a lot about, excites me about this meeting because a lot of you are sharing the planning part, the vision part. Some of you are playing for real. And bringing these parts together are sort of my reaction to the Florida presentation was, okay, now let's get real.
Well, I think part of getting real is also bringing the parts together, but bringing the people together. And the rift that exists out there today is truly a challenge with the short amount of time that we have to deal with so many of the crises that's going on.
It's like slavery. It's exactly like slavery, right? Everybody's got their own little personal agendas going on, and they have their own agendas, and it's all the, I just call it dog shit that's going on. I hate to use those slangy words, but I just want to point out that it's not just lofty ideas that gets us there. It's actually working hard to get the job done. It doesn't really matter whether it's conservation or anything else. Conservation is really the game, it seems to me. And it's going to be the game in the next 10 years, as you said, in Florida, but also every other place on the planet. So I think just whether it's planting one tree, whether it's helping one little park get in place, whether it's building one trail, whether it's inspiring some people in a community group, whether it's mobilizing major resources to acquire something, it's like we got to play really, really hard.
I also think we can find common ground in conservation that can bridge some of the gap that we're seeing nationally. I think the people's connection with nature is a starting point, and we got to figure out how to make inroads there as well, because the obstacles politically and socially are huge to the kinds of actions that we want to take.
It's like, I was just in the Middle East, and there's this promoted conflict between Saudi and Qatar and Iran. And the politics there use the excuses of religion or other dimensions of it to really cause this polarization. And it's really serious polarization. Yet, I mean, the people are just people. So you're speaking to how do you actually, I mean, today is not the day when we should be talking about country X first. Right. We should be talking about how we develop collaborations between different aspects of communities to bring things together.
You're here.
And it's just kind of ridiculous. So we see that articulated well at the global scale, but in our own little communities, how do we build common ground? That's what you're saying, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it is using little things like just us little people and us little strategies around open space to build this kind of consensus and collaboration to go forward. I think it's the only shot we've got. So that's why I keep saying geography and geodesign people have a special role to play in the 21st century, because we have the framework, we have the methods, the kind of science, the technology that is expanding, that can actually bring about collaboration and sensible, rational methods to create a better future. And these are lofty terms, but then it requires doing all the, I'll say it one last time and then I apologize, dog shit work behind the scenes to actually make it really happen. So that's my thought about Florida is, you know, play Monopoly and play hard.
Well, we have a well-known satire writer named Carl Hyacin from Florida, and he likes to say, I'll keep your analogies going, if you take the United States on its side and shake it, all the shit settles down to Florida. Mm-hmm. So we have an increasingly complex, I mean, there's no shortage of it to get into that kind of work.
It's good fertilizer. It's good fertilizer.
But I I don't want to take all the breath up here. So, but one thought is that I think the green infrastructure idea that I've learned about some from Esri, and that's one of these nonpartisan things. And
Yes.
you know, I use the Panther to try to engage the wide public, but it's ultimately the green infrastructure that the Panther represents that every single person, from the air they breathe to the water we drink. And I think those kind of visions are super useful.
We're talking about your Florida case, but for all of you, for the lands that you love or the projects that you're doing, the philosophy remains the same. We need to have good science. We also have to have a conceptual plan. So I just say you guys should hook up, the three of you, to build a plan, to really take this forward. And I would just simply say I would figure out how to get funding to get TPL to create such a plan to mobilize it. That would be my sort of suggestion. So that's where I think what's next. And then there's the sensationalizing of it. Let's just talk about this for a minute. I'm on the board of National Geographic. We've talked about doing a special program for that Florida environment. That would be really interesting. But I'm a little reluctant because is it your experience, Brees and Will, that big stories are helpful, that the public generally gets aware, or do they take away from your ability to work the back office and get the thing done? It's worth the talk, you know.
Yeah, I think big stories are helpful, and the more specific you get, the more you get into winners and losers.
Yeah, okay.
So, and you saw that certainly in the thinking about a national map of the areas that should be protected.
Yes.
People get behind the idea when it's a big idea. The minute you start saying your land, all of a sudden,
Yeah.
it changes.
Yes, it is. So for those of you not familiar with it, we did a project called the Green Infrastructure Project here a couple years ago. Hugh Keegan, my dear colleague in the audience, someplace here, he was here a minute ago. Yeah, he worked his heart out to bring all of the best information together, overlaid it, brought together. We thought that we would put this on the web, everybody would start to use it. It didn't happen exactly that way because while it's the right thing to think about, how do you make it real at a local level? That's where contention happens, and that's why I say Florida could use the professional help of TPL to sort of bring this methodology quietly, working in the background, making the trades, doing all the work that Lincoln did analogy-wise to really make it happen. And that's not secret sauce, but it's not well known and well understood. It isn't just coming with the geodesign concept. I mean, that we could do on a paper napkin in a way. GIS helps us bring better credibility to it and more specificity to it, but ultimately it's the political discourse bringing a community together that really makes it happen.
Jack, can I
Yes.
add a thought
Sure,
to your
please,
story
yes.
point? I love your use of Lincoln's image. Lincoln was also someone who had a continental vision, particularly with regard to railroads. He grew up as a railroad lawyer. And at the same time that he was promoting that development vision, he created, I'm getting a little echo here, he created the precursor of the first national park in the world at Yosemite. So while he was in the middle of this war and he was trying to write the Emancipation Proclamation and everything else, he had the presence of mind to think about where the infrastructure should go without the tools that you have today, and how you had to counterbalance that with magnificent conservation.
Yes.
And I think that we can take his example right now, using storytelling and other tools, to do the same thing when it's an even more urgent imperative than it was in 1864 when he created Yosemite.
Anybody going to be here tonight? So in this room, we have one of the great American knowledgeable people on Lincoln. He's going to give a Lincoln address tonight. So you're invited if you're staying overnight. It starts at 5:30 this evening. His name is Larry Burgess. He ran the Lincoln Center here in our little town, ran the library system, but he also worships Lincoln and has been one of my closest friends in bringing better understanding about this incredible person. So there you have it. So that's what's next about Florida. Let me ask, how many people enjoyed this conference? Okay, you have to leave the room. that person didn't raise their hands. But anyway, it was a good conference, I think, yet again. And we covered a wide spectrum of stuff. And from my perspective, it continues to be a narrative going along. It is not a story that has a beginning and the end. It's a narrative that will continue to evolve after us. It's an old story. It's an old narrative. The Japanese, looking at gardens, started this notion of designing with nature. It's evolved through the centuries with the British and others. It's now showing up here in its modern form using technology, but the same kind of design thinking. It's interesting. With technology. So it's a narration that's going to continue to evolve. And it will, this is a kind of movement in my view. I said this on Tuesday. It's a kind of movement. And strong movements, if you study them in history, have two aspects. One of them is they have a narrative, not a story. And whether it's democracy as a movement or communism as a movement or whatever, other movements. And they also have this other dimension, which is creative cells, creative centers. And these creative centers are 10 or 20 people that are working together in the context of the narrative. And you've seen this in your own organization, Will, with different offices that are carrying the general narration along, but they're working locally, but operating in a context of narration. And Carl, what you've done in the last year with expanding the narrative into 90 universities with cells of people that are growing, it's the thing that will take the movement and make it spread. And those of you who are in private practice, you are starting in different projects with little events here and customizing, creating, responding to the forces of demand and need in your own ways to create that happening. So we are all, whether it's in the academy or in private sector or in technology, we're all part of that narration. And the narration is a great living story that's inevitable, in my view. And we desperately need it. As you spoke here about Florida facing these challenges, globally we're facing exactly the challenges. So I've said all of this, but I'm saying it because we now want to ask the question, what's next for this event? What's next for the thing that is the narration? And let's just hear it among the four of you guys. What do you think should be next? Brees?
At this event specifically?
Yeah, start there.
Well, one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about, we've kind of mastered being able to defend the opportunity costs of our investments by using data and science and these community processes to get the community to tell us what's important to them too, but back it up by science and data. So we can create these maps that show what we should be protecting, whether it's a corridor or an individual parcel for a park. But I think what we're not really good at yet is measuring the impacts, looking at the measurements and evaluation side of things over time, because we're making these assumptions, data-driven assumptions up front about what needs to be protected in our case. But are those things performing the way they should over time? And generally, a lot of times our parks in particular will perform well for maybe a decade. And then you have things like displacement and gentrification and other things happening in our neighborhoods that cause a point of stop and reflect. Is this still the right type of park for that place? But we don't have good systems in place yet, beyond a place-based, a neighborhood-based, or nationally or internationally, really, to measure the impacts of what we're designing and what we're creating on the ground. So I think that would be an interesting topic.
Like an interesting topic for us to pick up next year and talk about evaluation. Yeah, I think what comes in my mind is the SDGs at the UN level, and that's the global sustainability goals with indicators about how we're doing. And that framework is going into place. It's supposed to all be in place by 2030 if the world is still here, and it's supposed to give us monitoring of a few hundred indicators of how we're doing in everything from gender equality and human health to forest loss or growth. And the approach to be able to build that is what I like to call Geo Accounting. It's accounting for all the things that people need to care about in the 21st century, with small geographic units aggregated to larger geographic units called countries reporting into a UN framework globally. So I think this Geo Accounting, I mean, there's two words that Bill Miller and I used to talk about a lot. One of is Geodesign, and the other one is Geo Accounting. And you're really talking about driving Geo Accounting and pushing it right into Geodesign. You design and you do Geo Accounting. And Carl, your methodology, it is the evaluation modeling, except it's not just I do a design and quickly evaluate. We also want to set in frame Geo Accounting as a concept so that we are constantly aware with real-time information coming on how we're doing. And we love that idea as humans. We love the idea of also comparative analysis. They're doing okay here, they're not doing okay there. Or I'm doing okay here, I'm not doing okay there. And that's the frame that the UN has come together and try to organize as a kind of an accounting structure for the environment, for humans in the environment, for the whole 9 yards. Climate change, geo-accounting, where is it happening, what's happening with air pollution, what's happening with air quality, all of those different things. So I think you're right in speaking this, that the next step is to not only acknowledge these evaluation models in a greater context, but then how do we sort of organize them so we synoptically, as well as bottom-up, organize them into comparable units that we can agree on and measure and make progress with. Because it's not just the single design element, it's the general, the people in Southern California are not doing so well. And your park score does this so well, and we saw the reaction to that, setting up competition just like a Monopoly game, right? Set up the game, then everybody starts to participate. So I think you're right. So you were talking, generally speaking, about what's next for the geodesign methodology things, I suppose. What about what's next for this conference? Anybody have any ideas for what we should... First, do you want to do this again next year? I guess that's the question.
Yes.
Are you sure? Yes. You want to be here?
Yes.
You will be here?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I have to check. Don't you have to check all the time? You going to be here, Carl? Yeah. Carl, Mike is coming.
If we do next year what we did this year, which is have the academics meeting the Geodesign Collaborative in the 2 days before the summit, we're going to have an interesting problem, and that is we're likely to have 2 or 3 times many academics here than we had this year. And if we're lucky, we'll fill the damn room. So we have a very interesting issue. We had people here from about 40 or 50 countries for the 2 days before this meeting. It was much more international. We had 40 presentations. Each one of them was 5 or 6 minutes long. It's going to be a really difficult thing to put lots of presentations and some long ones that are really interesting and good together. I don't know how we're going to do that. I'll tell you the 2 problems that we had. One is visas to the United States of America. Trust me, it's a problem. The second thing is we had a lot of requests for broadcasting live, really seriously, because that's the only way the students can go. The faculty might be able to come, but the students can't come. Sure, Cal Poly can come. Sure, USC can come. But what about Nairobi, all right? And once you're global, the technology of broadcasting is the only sane way to get people really interested. The third thing is this, from an academic's perspective. One of the things that came out from our conversations is we need to have a master class. We have to have a dozen people who have a lot of experience talking to a couple of hundred people who have less experience and saying, these are the things that work, these are the things that don't work. That's why your talk was interesting, okay? Because you went through and Shannon's talk was interesting. These are the things you need to do. And different scales of problem have different packages of those things that you have to do. And I think that organizing it as not so much a show and tell, but a show and tell of what worked and what didn't work, which is the way we did it. We had these meetings, these discussions in small groups. We had lots of them. We had 12 of them all together. And they were all about what didn't work as well as what did work. And summarizing that is really, really important.
Okay, so Ryan, where are you? I'm hunting around. Okay, Ryan, 3 things I got from Carl's suggestion is, one is, can the academics stay for a few days into the program?
Most of them have stayed.
Okay.
So the question of is it integrated or is it separated?
Yeah, okay. So I think it's both separated and integrated.
I agree.
So that's decision number 1. I think number 2 is I will fund live streaming next year. Does that make sense? So that'll go out on the opening. And then number 3 is we need more space for exhibits. That's a challenge for me. I mean, we got the cafeteria, but next year we'll have a brand new building across the Sankey. But can we divide it into 2 places? Probably. So we have 2 spaces, and we deal with the logistics of that. And then, okay, that's what's. So do we all agree we'll have it here? Do you want to have it here again? It's certainly convenient for me because I don't have to travel. And so, all right. Then what else? What's next? Right here.
I guess trying to kind of think about this panel and the whole issue of, let's get real and let's get down and dirty, let's figure out how deals are made, et cetera, which I think is all a good way to think about implementation and how we move ahead. That led me to say, why don't we have several legislators, whether they're federal or state, whomever they are, who have done this work, who believe in what's going on. Maybe they've made some of the deals to make things happen. I would look for people, by the way, from contested districts. With gerrymandering, we have less and less and less that you can choose from. I think that's one of the greatest challenges to democracy, is gerrymandering. So I would, we want people who listen. Most politicians, at least used to, they were listening. They're back home every weekend. So I would try to find some people who have to listen because they're in contested districts. And then I think you may get some good idea, using this kind of information. I mean, ideally, we would find some people who had some knowledge of these techniques and the methods and the like, but that might be one of the ways to introduce that concept of sort of getting real.
Okay, so the way I would interpret that is, this is a geodesign professional conference. It's about methods and tools and results. And then the impact of those results into the political decision-making, playing Monopoly game, we peripherally touch. And I think your talk really touched all of our minds. We got to move in that direction. But I think this is still a methods class. What I would say is we want to have those people who are insightful playing the real game that could add some color to it, right? So if we had a keynote, like for example, Governor OMalley is going to be here tomorrow. He took on that's Maryland, and he took on the green printing for Maryland. And this guy's a masterful politician. And in 2 weeks, Governor Newsom is going to be here. And he's confronted with the same challenges. Maybe I should ask you to come down, because he wants to build some kind of a geospatial infrastructure for the state to address the wildfires and the water and those kind of things. Maybe we could work on him to be a keynote speaker next year. Yeah. Would that be?
And he gets it.
And he gets it, yeah. You've spent time with him?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when he was mayor, he was all over parks. I mean, he showed up at every park dedication and spoke articulately about the connection between people and nature.
Agree we should try to get him next year? Yeah. Yeah, all right. Let's try it. What else for next?
Building on Breeze's comments about sort of more of a long-running functional assessment of parks and the successes of what we're doing, and sort of coming back to that notion that we really are looking at trying to preserve in some capacity half the Earth, at least. I think there might be some value in a broader conversation beyond the protected area approach and the conserved lands into more a matter of, how can we go about developing areas that still have functional aspects for the ecological contributions of the developed lands, that we can't just be looking at protected areas and then unconstrained development in the other half. I think we really need to be looking at and I think Carl's, the IGC, where there was the notion of innovations and changes to how we conduct best practices. And maybe that needs to be a bit more of a high focus, that it's not just a matter of avoiding the lands that we need to preserve, but maintaining the functionality on the areas that we are dominating. Thanks.
So there's the methodology of geodesign, Carl's 6 steps or elaborations or extensions of it. And that's been largely the focus, and then seeing it in practice. What you're saying is the practice has to show a spectrum of different solutions for conservation work and green infrastructure work. Is that what I understood? Now, Ed Wilson, HalfEarth author, is going to speak at the user conference this summer. So those of you who are coming, will be enjoyable. And we are funding his HalfEarth database. This is going to take us 5 years to do it, but it'll go through all 16 different species groups: amphibians, big trees, desert, large mammals, etc., and insects and birds. So these are massive models that are building it based on species observation correlated with imagery. So we can set up a frame so we can monitor for each of the 16 groups the hotspot changes on the planet. That'll be a framework for doing very broad-scale geodesign. We are troubled in some ways by this. Not only do we need to do it, like Hugh's work on the green infrastructure, we need to understand it, we need to make the patterns. We're troubled because will it matter? Will people just ignore it anyway? This will be all data that will become on the web and available as open services as it incrementally gets done. It will take us a few years to do that. But his view is not simply pure conservation, absolutely no touch like that preserve is doing, but also a spectrum of agriculture and other things to protect the HalfEarth environment. So how many of you are interested in exploring, maybe as one of the subsections here, the vocabulary of conservation? Because we're moving from geodesign into conservation. Should this be maintained just as geodesign process, or should we look at, as the world changes, a larger spectrum of footprints of solutions for protecting green infrastructure? I kind of want to get a sense. Am I making sense?
I have a question.
So, Stephen, what do you want to say? Okay.
And can afford to have conservation and agriculture and hydrology and all kinds of other. Design has always said give me everything I can work with. That's what makes it wonderful and powerful.
I was wondering whether you were talking about the need for the narrative, like whether you'd be willing to take on HalfEarth as a narrative, through which you're designing a future that fits that. I mean, that's kind of specific, but...
Yeah, of course, it'll take us a couple years to get this database, although the first species group is going to come out, I think it's birds this summer. Sean here, Sean Breyer. So we will be incrementally doing this, but Carl had an idea, what was it, 2 years ago, of saying, let's do a design shred for the world. Wasn't that your scenario? Yes, go ahead.
We have at least one university in every country.
So there's
What I said was if we had a university in the IGC, in the international collaboration in every country, we could probably do a charrette for the globe pretty easily.
So there's two approaches to designing the future of the world. One is top-down. We have a design group that makes the decisions. The other one is bottom-up. And the bottom-up approach is what the UN has decided with the SDGs. We could take a satellite picture and show the forest loss top-down, right? But the UN has organized with each of the statistical branches of the UN in each country, like the US Census in the US, the Kenya Census in Kenya, and those organizations are responsible for gathering all the statistics of the several hundred SDGs into this sub-national boundary bunch of polygons that then gets federated into the system of systems. If we took that same federated approach and we said one university per country or 2 universities, it doesn't really matter, and they just came up with this conceptual master plan next year for their country for conservation only, just for conservation only. Okay, well, for urbanization and conservation, okay, you set up the terms for it, but that would be an interesting challenge if we could get that done next year and present it here.
Look at Jorg's study that was shown on Monday of the growth of Cairo over the next 50 years. And you've got Egypt in the bag already.
Yeah, well, I don't want to define the actual methods for what they do. That'll be up to a team, up to them or however you define the scope of work. But that could be, an ambitious project worth doing that's reported here in 1 year. We say, look, the time is running out. We've got the living atlas content here now. We've got elevation for the world. We've got water for the world. We've got imagery for the world. We've got a few other factors. We've got demographics for the world. We got land cover for the world. What am I missing? And we'll have at least a couple of the chapters of Ed Welson's biodiversity hotspots for the world. And they could be, they won't have the same resolution, but that could be the base for taking on a very ambitious goal of doing this. So the UN has taken also, Carl, the philosophy of the coalition of the willing. So we started with only 6 countries. Ireland, Senegal, Mexico, Philippines, and so on. And they all set up a server and they're doing the things, the prototype. Now it's 19 countries. Next year, we think between 50 and 60 countries. So it's incrementing up. We don't have to have the whole world in order to initiate the vision of creating a green infrastructure plan for the planet. And if we did this right, perhaps with National Geographic, we could sort of set in motion this big idea. I mean, there's lots of great ideas, but there's then doing the work. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. So I've really enjoyed this conference. It's my 2nd year here, and I think it's got a great feel, very interesting combination of topics and speakers, and very different from a typical GIS conference. But it's far away for those of us in Europe. And I'm just wondering whether there would be a possibility to introduce, to encourage geodesign as a theme within, for example, the user conferences in Europe, or indeed other conferences that Esri is sponsoring.
Yes. I mean, we have in the past. Sometimes it picks up in some countries, sometimes it doesn't. So we can't bend iron. We can introduce the concepts, we can have sessions, and they're either popular and people go to them or they don't. You know, that's the, yeah, that's it. Yes.
Hi, I'm Jim Spee from University of Redlands, and I'm actually in the School of Business, and I'm working on a parallel project around sustainable business development, which dovetails really into this. And we're talking always about people, profit, planet. And almost every presentation I saw where they succeeded, they looked at all three of those. They may have had different names for it. And I think, I remember when Jane Goodall was here, she talked about finding a spiritual reason in the areas near the park to preserve these corridors between the various chimp populations. I think the same thing in Florida. You're trying to find a connection to the people and the conservation. So I can't see how you can do those independently. You've got to have some economic basis for it. You've got to have a conservation argument that makes sense, and then you got to get people behind it. And I think continuing to work on all three of those streams is going to be how we move forward on that. So conservation without the backing of the people, the local people, and without their feeling like this is really important. I think the Parks Project is a great, every one of these successful implementations we've seen is where that works. When it falls apart is when you leave one of those elements out.
I'd say something to that. You know what's interesting when we think about how people tax themselves for conservation or parks and open spaces, we have this saying that red plus blue equals green. You know, it doesn't matter whether it's a Democratic or Republican community across the board. You know, people, they feel that connection to open space. They know intrinsically how important conservation and parks are to their community, to their well-being, to their economic well-being. You know, they understand the benefits of these things. So when they see that language on the ballot, they say, yes, I will tax myself to have more of this. But I think, you know, there's a tremendous opportunity in the country now to connect that, the piece of where people are actually taxing themselves for parks and conservation in this case. It could be for anything. It could be for healthy foods. It could be for better infrastructure. But then a lot of these communities do not have good comprehensive plans and good designs for how they're going to actually use that money strategically on the things that they voted to use it for. There's a tremendous opportunity in this country to do just that, to really connect what people intrinsically feel about parks and open space or whatever they see as important in their community, but make sure that we have the right plans and design and the bottom-up support for those plans to make them a reality. But then again, to measure and monitor and make sure these things are performing the way they should and that they get upgraded and updated, you know, when they should.
Let me add to that the interest is not just in this country, it's in Australia, it's in the European community, it's in the Inuit community in northern Canada, it's in Chile, and a lot of the work that we're doing that continues to be US-centric isn't directly translatable overseas, but I think that if you focus on the practice of large landscape conservation, which I think is part of what you're talking about here, and use the community that Carl's putting together to focus on that discipline, then you might have something to which to apply the database that Mr. Wilson wants to put together.
Other ideas for next year?
So,
yes.
It was very inspiring to hear about Geo Accounting and looking at global scale. Geo meaning Earth. We have geoengineering, we have geopolitics, we have geoeconomy, and we have geodesign. And it seems that Geo Accounting is great concept and idea, but there are issues of measurements. How do we measure satisfaction, happiness, walking in a conserved land? How do we measure walking in a park? And the other issue is who owns it? Who owns? If we have a benevolent owner, TPL it's very different than we have like a private sector owning it. So these issues of correct measurements and also ownership seems very relevant. If we look at Geo Accounting and look at it at a global scale will help us this intergenerational fairness. If we are, whatever that we inherited from the past, are we leaving it, that amount, non-decreasing for future generations? Thank you.
Yeah, generally speaking, these 230 some indicators include happiness, by the way. They are, and what we're doing is working with them to spatialize their indicators into these subnational units. So in the Dubai meetings, there was this whole session of how do you do geo accounting for happiness? You know, do you do a smiley face on the map or whatever it is, and how do you measure sentiment? You know, Dubai wants to be the happiest place in the world, and they have all these indicators and measurement systems that they've set up to try to make some sense of what this abstract spiritual concept of happiness is all about. So it was very interesting to listen to all of the social psychologists, people from around the planet, meet and talk about what they meant. But I'm left with the idea of this is going to evolve into a series of indicators. And those indicators are going to be aggregated and measured and thrown out to us. This is the world that we're moving into, a digital world where virtually everything is measured and made available in various indicators to drive behavior. I mean, these stories, we have to be careful of what the story is and what the narration is, because the stories and narrations affect human behavior. The indicators will affect human behavior. How we bring this together as a society is far beyond geo accounting here, but I just want to make you aware of this is going on at a global level, orchestrated by the UN in various ways. Okay, any other final comments? Because then I have a final close. Yes? Yeah, but we can't hear you.
I wrote this one down. So people participate mostly in the geodesign framework agenda when they have more of a cultural equity in the place. But when we encourage sustainable practices, we're saving energy, we're saving costs and the environment from further exploitation. But can we make a greater connection to how we can quantify returns on sustainable infrastructure when we talk about geodesign? How do you feel about that idea?
So say it one more time so we get it.
So sustainable infrastructure, I mean, people, when we talk about the geodesign framework, we're getting stakeholders around the table because they care about that place. They have cultural equity in that place that we're talking about, and that's how we're getting them to the table to even start to talk about geodesign. How do we quantify that and look at energy savings, cost savings, and how that geodesign framework is actually impacting our sustainable infrastructure going forward?
You mean how do we do it? Or the method for doing it? Or how do we get awareness to do it? Or
seeing more of that in our goals of our projects, of how is that outcome of our geodesign framework, our practices actually affecting our ability to save the environment, save costs, save energy, and stop that exploitation of our environment.
Are you asking the question how we build into the design process impact measurement so that it affects the design?
Yes.
Yeah. Carl, you want to respond to that?
Sure. Most of the models that you're looking for already exist in different levels of complexity, and they need to be put in a library that is interoperable with design tools so that you can press one button and get the result as reliably as you can, knowing that there's noise in the system. So anytime you see a decimal point, don't trust it.
Yeah.
But if you see a scale from very much better to no change to worse to very much worse, trust it. And somewhere in between those 5 levels and the decimal point is likely to be reliable for public policy. So complexity is not the answer. Understandability is the answer.
Well, I'll give it a shot. The concept of geodesign is that you do a design and you quickly evaluate its consequences, right? And that's Geodesign 101. And to be able to do that evaluation, you have to have some kind of well thought out models. And what we saw in the last few days were different attempts to do that. Some of them were cost models, some of them were air pollution models, some of them were transportation impact models. So what I saw in this conference for the first time is a commercial company that builds those evaluation models. Let's see, are they still here? They're called Auto something. It's not Autodesk, but it's like Auto something. AutoCase, okay, yeah. And they may have left already, but there were 4 of them here. And we're going to try to wire their evaluation model into the urban product so that as we design urban buildings, it'll quickly do a green infrastructure or a green evaluation and translate the greenness into financial terms. That's what their model does. They have connected their technology to Autodesk's technologies in the past. So you've got technology integrating with technology to do this. And I just think that that's going to emerge. But this is the first time I saw it as a commercial little thing that people could buy. And when it gets to that level, then it's going to go into practice and people will use it as a standard operation. I don't know if that helps you, but yes?
Thank you. I don't know if this is a question or a comment. I'm not quite sure what it is, but one of the things that I think about when I think about changing climate is as animals migrate, so do humans. And so as conditions change globally, people will move across the globe as they have for millennia. So is there a way to, I don't know, make a prediction somehow using geodesign tools of where people will be moving in response to changing climate, changing environments, what areas will be inundated with people, what areas will be opened up, so sort of this blinking on and off, patchy distributions of people, animals, etc.
Yeah, Hugh, do you want to talk about this? So in the lab across the way, they call it the application prototype lab. Hugh used to run it. There's still very interesting people there. They're looking at where they're going to move from. They've done a lot of work on where species will move to if they could move. That's based on the IPPC models at a global scale. And you've probably seen some of that work. And some of the heat areas around the equator, places, big cities like Singapore and in regions like Indonesia and central Brazil, man, it's not going to be habitable. People are just going to move out of them, right? So then the other thing is, where will they move to? What is the most habitable, by northern Alaska and, the North Slope Borough is going to be, it's going to be, we make joke of it, but wake up, if we can't really get the lid on this climate change, it's all going to happen. So realtors are going to do their thing and people will move and sort of humans will just do their thing. Isn't that weird as a thought? Yet it is within not our lifetimes, but it'll be certainly in the children's lifetimes if that's going to happen. And, when will ecological collapse occur? That's what some people say. That even makes those places, the sort of big syndrome of everything collapsing down. I don't know. It's the dark side of conversation. And somebody is going to do that as a PhD thesis or as a team or something like that, futurist thing. When will that happen? When will the lights go on that this is really a crisis on our little spaceship and the oxygen ain't going to work out or something? I don't know the analogy to even describe it. But it is, meanwhile, let's look on the positive side. If we could organize an effort like what Carl is suggesting is national plans that consider changes and migration patterns in every region of the world or country in the world, and we got the right press, this idea might really surface and simply say, there is, with all the negative news going on in the next couple of years, it's going to get worse and worse, so we just got to realize that. There is a bright spot, and that is that there is a vision of being able to do geodesign to both be resilient to climate change and accommodate this, and also to create a better future. So for me, that's the only shot we've got. I mean, population's got to cut in half, right? This is the right, and it's we're either going to do that by thinking about it, or it's going to happen as a result of the consequences of change. That's going to happen. I won't be around, but so if we could motivate people to stop having babies, you know, that's said as a joke, but it's true. We've really got to do that quick, and then also have a vision for the plan for the planet, which is built bottom up. Well, with that, I'm going to ask Carl, what would it take to be able to do that exercise?
10 people and $2 million.
10 people. 10 people? Supported by $2 million.
Supported by 10 million. Those 10 people would have to organize it. They'd have to do a lot of traveling and a lot of thinking and a lot of talking. And by continent, probably. And we're slowly on the way to being able to, I can easily see that happening within a 5-year period. Yeah. I'd hope to be within a 5-year period.
So suppose we didn't have $2 million and 10 people, how would you do it otherwise?
You find the 2 million and you find the 10 people.
Okay, anybody in the room want to work like hell for the next year? One of the 10? One person.
No, there's 10 people.
Did it for a year, for God's sakes. We had 90 universities, approximately 800 people working on these projects. There was no budget, and it was all done by word of mouth. So if you basically greased it with some people who could cause universities to understand it, all of whom are thinking about the same problem, right? All of them. But get them to agree on the same terminology, on the same color codes, on their own local priorities, and see what happens. That's an experiment, but the payoff is enormous. The potential payoff is enormous. Think of it as big science rather than as small geodesign.
Yeah, it's big design science. Yes, Stephen.
I sent some of my colleagues this morning a snippet from one of the things that I do to stay optimistic is I receive in my email every morning, mostly, an email update from an organization called FutureEarth.org. Google it and subscribe. It is this community and this conversation writ quite large on a global scale. You've got every continent is already covered out there. There are an enormous number of well-meaning, well-intentioned, both academic and industrial and governmental activities. The person who can figure out how to bring coordination to this, we've always said that what designers and landscape architects do is they orchestrate. There's some orchestration to be done here, and it may well be out of this community that orchestration can come. Google FutureEarth.org and sign up.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. I'm told we've got to stop, ladies and gentlemen. It's amazing. You guys are amazing. Thank you. And thank you to all of you.